not least, Professor Duncan Foley, also of the New School Economics Department.
Well, it's a mixed blessing to go last, because many of the things that one might want to say have already been raised. But I actually, as I thought about this session, wanted to come at it from a slightly different point of view. For one thing, I'd like to look at a little bit more from the point of view of the United States and the history of the United States, and approach this with a sort of sketch of some historical reminders about imperialism in U.S. history. And then I'll try to end up with a couple of questions that this story raises in my mind. The U.S. Did try very seriously to become an imperial power in the late 19th century. There was a large political movement that explicitly advocated imperialism. For example, we built what was called the Blue Water Navy, which was a very expensive proposition. And the outcome of that adventure with imperialism was a pretty traditional colonial imperialism. It wasn't a hugely successful or large empire, but we did manage to get away from Spain fairly big chunks of its old empire, and we started to compete over the division of spoils in China very vigorously with what was called the open door policy. So at that time, the U.S. seemed to be positioning itself to be a competitor in the first globalization model, which was really a model of colonial imperialism. I mean, the imperialism, as has been pointed out, was not secret or hard to understand. It was just direct colonial imperialism and coloring the map in its own way. What I think is very important is to realize that that model of imperialism was blamed by a great many people, especially U.S. policymakers, for the debacle of the First World War and the collapse of the international economy after the First World War and the coming of the Second World War. One interesting, to me, extremely interesting and significant point is to look at what the United States did when it reached the hegemonic position that it did at the end of the Second World War. There were many possibilities there. It might have been that the U.S. would have tried simply to become the big super empire and inherit the mantle of the French and British empires. But in fact, things took a different turn, at least in theory. So Roosevelt seemed to take the position that he wanted a world that was decolonialized, where the colonial imperialism would be, to a large degree, dismantled. And I think his motive and the motive of the large political movement of which he was a spokesman was the feeling that they did not want to have a repetition of the inter-capitalist rivalries that led to the debacle of the First World War. So one aspect of post-World War II American imperialism is that it shifts gears, to my mind. And one big priority is to avoid inter-capitalist rivalries among the developed capitalist nations. That becomes certainly one of the most important elements in what you would call U.S. foreign policy, broadly speaking. And I don't have any trouble in understanding it as an imperialist policy. That is a policy that's intended to try to organize the world in favor of the interests of the United States and the interests that it promotes, which are largely capitalist style of development. And as far as I can see, what was mentioned, and Prabhat puts a lot of emphasis on this in his books, that this is very closely intertwined with money, with the financial system and with money. And there are a lot of different aspects of this which we might want to talk about some more. The most obvious one is the point, I think it's been mentioned several times, that because of the establishment of a world dollar standard, the U.S. is exempt from a budget constraint in certain important ways that bind on other countries. And in particular, that exempts the U.S. from running into balance of payments crises when it undertakes foreign military adventures. This came up, first of all, in the Vietnam episode, but it's been a constant theme ever since then, that it gives U.S. policymakers a much freer scope for the deployment of expensive foreign and military policy than would otherwise be the case. But if you look at this from another point of view, you can see that the privileged role of the dollar, the hegemony of the dollar, is a kind of tribute that the rest of the capitalist world is paying to the United States. Now, what is the nature of that relationship is one question that I think we might want to understand. We've focused a lot, and I think it's very appropriate to focus on the way imperialism regulates the relation between metropolitan capitalist countries and poorer countries in the periphery. But I think it's also equally important to understand what it means as a dynamic system of control and organization among the metropolitan capitalist countries. Okay, with this sort of general historical background, let me pose a couple of questions which we might discuss. I would certainly be interested in them. I'm in the process of discussing these with Rama Vasudevan, so I'd like to just mention her name because a lot of what I'm saying has come out of interchanges and conversations with her. One puzzle is that if you look at actual American military interventions, a great number of them, particularly the Vietnam one, was in the interests of preserving dying colonial regimes. And that doesn't really make sense, because if the U.S. had seriously decided that it wanted to go to a post-colonial mode of running the world, why on earth did we expend the resources that we did in Vietnam essentially to preserve a remnant of French imperial colonialism? So is that a logic? Is that part of the logic? Is there a logic of imperialism behind that, or is there not? Second, we talk a lot about capitalist imperialism, and this, I think, was mentioned before, but I think it's only fair, if you're going to talk about capitalism, that you have to have some idea in the hearer's mind of what you think the alternative to capitalism is. And in the Cold War, it was widely accepted on both the left and the right that the Soviet communist system was a viable alternative to capitalism as an organization of economic development and resource allocation. I don't really believe that. And I would like to put on the table that it was always a kind of a shadow boxing, that the Soviet Union was not a world adversary in any serious sense and did not present any real alternative to the spread of capitalism. So what were all these imperial interventions about? I ask myself. It seems to me that if you look back with the advantage of hindsight, it would have been, and the question was, how can you integrate, for example, Vietnam into the world capitalist economy, the dumbest thing you could have done was fight the Vietnam War. I mean, what you wanted was to get a rational communist regime in there, and you can count on them to realize eventually that they have to integrate their economy into the world capitalist economy, which is exactly what they're doing. In a way, this kind of puzzle has dogged me all of my life, like Chile. Okay, so what was so terrible by Allende? I mean, Allende was going to nationalize some copper mines. In fact, after the reactionaries took over in Chile, they nationalized the copper mines, I think. Is that right? Huh? Or kept them. Yeah, all right. So Allende may have been a very bad manager of Chilean fiscal matters, and he might have bankrupted Chile trying for some kind of quixotic egalitarian regime. But was it ever credibly an alternative to some kind of world capitalism? Or if it was, what was that alternative? I just would like to have a little more discussion about that question. I think to my mind, what it means is that what we're really talking about when we talk about capitalist imperialism comes out of what Rob Pollan said and David Gordon's ideas of the social structures of accumulation. We're talking about the kind of world capitalism in some sense. We're talking about a shape of world capitalism. We're not talking about whether we have world capitalism or we don't have world capitalism. So so my theory conclusions run something like this, that insofar as a major feature of post-World War II U.S. imperialism is U.S. hegemony and the avoidance of intercapitalist rivalry. That's going on quite steadily, and there's a lot of continuity, and there is very little to make one change one's mind about that. Insofar as the content of U.S. imperialism has to do with the particular shaping of the relation between the development of poorer countries, then I think perhaps there's a lot more to talk about. And just I'd like to finish by saying the part of this that's even more mysterious to me, and which I learned a lot from Prabhat Patnaik's writings about, is just how class relations in the poorer countries fits into this whole story. There's a tendency to treat the poorer countries of the world as unified, they're poor countries. But of course they aren't poor countries. They're countries with a few rich people and a lot of poor people. And the question of just how that works out and how we regulate the relations between classes in the developing countries and classes in the metropolitan capitalist countries seems to be more on the point of what is the content of imperialism in our era.